A Chance Encounter, the story of Jamal and Eleanor. The city stirred to life with its usual cacophony of sounds, cars honking impatiently, buses hissing as they pulled into stops, and the rhythmic clatter of hurried footsteps. On the sidewalks, the streams of people moved in an unspoken choreography, each lost in their own race against time. Conversations buzzed in fragments, coffee cups were juggled between hands, and the urgency of another weekday morning gripped the streets. For Jamal Edwards, standing in the doorway of his modest apartment building, the morning seemed louder than usual. He adjusted the knot on his navy blue tie, his fingers fumbling as though this simple task were an alien ritual. The tie felt foreign, too tight, like it didn't belong. He had spent most of his life in hoodies and sneakers. Dressing sharply for a job interview felt both empowering and nerve-wracking, a bold step into unfamiliar territory. Behind him, the familiar hum of his mother's movements filled their small apartment. Angela Edwards bustled about the kitchen, balancing toast in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. Her nurse's scrubs were faded from years of countless shifts. Despite her exhaustion, her voice carried an unmistakable warmth as she called out to him. "You've got this, baby," she said, flashing him a proud, tired smile from across the room. "Go show them what you're made of." Jamal turned back to her, offering a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Ma. Don't work too hard today, okay?" Angela chuckled, waving him off.
"You know me, but don't worry about me. You've got bigger things to handle today. Go on, before you're late."
The door clicked shut behind him, and for a moment, Jamal stood still on the steps, breathing in the cool morning air. The weight of expectation settled on his shoulders. Today wasn't just another day. It was a potential turning point. A junior analyst position at one of the city's most respected financial firms was within his grasp. The chance to step out of the endless cycle of struggle that had defined so much of his life was finally here. The neighborhood stretched out before him, alive with activity. Weathered brownstones stood shoulder to shoulder with sleek, modern apartment buildings, their contrasting facades telling a story of a community caught between past and present. A bodegan owner swept his stoop, nodding at Jamal as he passed. Across the street, schoolchildren in pressed uniforms chattered loudly as they waited for their bus, their laughter briefly rising above the hum of morning traffic. But as Jamal walked, his eyes lingered on a boarded-up building a few blocks down. Its windows were dark and hollow, the wooden boards across them faded and splintered. Above the door, a crooked sign still read, "Johnson's Barber Shop." Jamal's steps faltered. Memories rushed back, sharp and vivid. As a boy, he had spent countless Saturdays in Mr. Johnson's shop. It had been a sanctuary for the neighborhood, a place where people gathered not just for haircuts, but for advice, jokes, and camaraderie. He could almost hear Mr. Johnson's voice as he trimmed Jamal's hair, scissors snipping in time with his words. "Education is your ticket, young man. Get that degree, and you'll see the world open up for you." Mr. Johnson had believed in him long before Jamal had believed in himself. Those words had carried him through the darkest moments. Late-night study sessions at community college, juggling part-time jobs to help his mother with rent, and now, this interview. Jamal had earned his associate's degree, and today he was ready to take the next step. Yet as much as he tried to focus on the opportunity ahead, a small voice in the back of his mind nagged at him. The reality was harsh. A young black man from this neighborhood would likely face silent judgment. He knew he was qualified, but the system often required him to prove his worth twice over. As he approached a busy intersection, the city seemed to press in closer, the noise and movement intensifying. The crosswalk signal blinked urgently, counting down the seconds. Jamal quickened his steps, weaving through the crowd. That's when he saw her. At the curb stood an elderly woman, her frail figure hunched slightly over a polished wooden cane. She was impeccably dressed, her tailored coat and neat curls speaking of a time when presentation was paramount. Yet there was something vulnerable in her stance, her knuckles white against the cane's dark wood, her faded blue eyes darting nervously between the traffic and the blinking signal. Jamal hesitated, glancing at his watch. He couldn't afford to be late. Not today. The smart thing would be to keep moving. But something about the woman held him in place. She didn't call for help, didn't gesture to anyone, and yet her unease was unmistakable. Before he could second-guess himself, Jamal changed course. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice gentle. "Would you like some help crossing the street?" The woman turned to him, startled. Her pale eyes studied him for a moment, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face. Then her expression softened. "Oh," she said, her voice quivering, "that's very kind of you, young man, but I wouldn't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble at all," Jamal replied, offering a warm smile. "I'd be happy to help." "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Whitmore," Jamal said. "I'm Jamal." He extended his arm, and after a brief hesitation, she took it. Her grip was firm, despite the tremor in her hands. "Ready when you are," Jamal said, matching her pace as they stepped into the crosswalk. The traffic seemed louder now, the roar of engines and impatient honks filling the air. A taxi crept forward, its driver tapping the horn as though to hurry them along. Instinctively, Jamal shifted his position, placing himself between the vehicle and Mrs. Whitmore. "Dreadful manners," she muttered, shaking her head. "In my day, drivers showed a bit more courtesy." They reached the opposite curb, and Jamal gently released her arm. He expected her to thank him and move on, but Mrs. Whitmore lingered, her hand still resting lightly on his sleeve. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady now. "It's rare to find such kindness these days, especially in a city like this, where everyone's always in such a rush." Jamal glanced at his watch, aware of the time slipping away. But there was something about Mrs. Whitmore, a quiet loneliness beneath her polished exterior, that kept him rooted to the spot. "Well," he said, "sometimes we all need a little help, right? My mom always says, what goes around comes around." Mrs. Whitmore's face lit up with a soft smile. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman. You were raised well." "She did her best," Jamal said, his tone tinged with pride. "Single mom, working as a nurse. She taught me the value of hard work and looking out for others." Mrs. Whitmore nodded approvingly. "Admirable. And what about you, Jamal? Where were you off to in such a hurry?" Jamal hesitated, debating how much to share. "I have a job interview," he said finally. "It's a big opportunity for me." Her eyes sparkled with interest. "Well, I wish you the best of luck. You seem like a fine young man. You deserve it." Jamal smiled, grateful for her words. "Thank you, ma'am." But just as he was about to take his leave, Mrs. Whitmore reached into her handbag. "Wait," she said, pulling out a small, elegant business card. "My late husband owned a financial firm. It's still in the family. I believe they're hiring. Tell them Eleanor Whitmore sent you." Jamal stared at the card, stunned. I don't know what to say. Thank you so much." Mrs. Whitmore smiled, patting his hand. "Kindness has a way of coming back to you, Jamal. Remember that." Jamal looked at the business card again. It was sleek and professional, bearing the name Whitmore and Brooks Financial Group. The embossed lettering gleamed under the morning sunlight, and for a moment, Jamal felt as though he were holding a golden ticket. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Absolutely," she said, her tone firm. "Kindness is a rare thing these days, and when I see it, I believe in rewarding it. Besides, I have a good feeling about you." Jamal nodded, still absorbing the magnitude of her offer. He slipped the card carefully into his pocket, mentally replaying the past few minutes. A simple act of helping someone cross the street had turned into something far more profound. "Well, I won't keep you any longer, young man," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice warm. "Go, shine, and remember, don't let them underestimate you." With that, she patted his arm one last time and turned to continue on her way, her cane tapping steadily against the pavement. Jamal watched her for a moment before turning back toward his original path. The rest of the walk to the financial firm felt surreal. The towering glass and steel skyscraper loomed ahead, its reflective surface shimmering like a beacon of opportunity. Jamal adjusted his tie once more, smoothing his shirt as he stepped into the lobby. The interior was sleek and modern, with marble floors and an impressive chandelier that sparkled overhead. Receptionists greeted visitors with practiced smiles, and the air buzzed with a quiet energy. Jamal approached the front desk, his heart pounding. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves threatening to take over. "I have an interview scheduled with Mr. Palmer at 9 a.m. The receptionist nodded and tapped away on her keyboard. "Jamal Edwards?" "Yes, it's me. Please, have a seat, Mr. Edwards. Someone will be with you shortly." Jamal thanked her and sat in the waiting area, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He glanced around, observing the other candidates. Most were dressed in sharp suits, their faces composed and confident. Jamal couldn't help but feel a twinge of insecurity. But then he thought of his mother, Angela, who had sacrificed so much for him. He thought of Mr. Johnson's words and the lessons they carried. And, of course, he thought of Mrs. Whitmore and the unexpected gesture of faith she had shown him. "You belong here," he whispered to himself. A few minutes later, a young woman in a tailored suit approached him. "Mr. Edwards, Mr. Palmer is ready to see you." Jamal stood, smoothing his tie once more, and followed her through a series of glass-walled offices. Finally, they reached a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the city skyline. "Mr. Edwards," said a man seated behind a polished desk. He was middle-aged, with sharp features and an air of authority. "Please, have a seat." Jamal sat down, meeting the man's gaze. The interview began with the usual questions: his education, his previous work experience, and his aspirations. Jamal answered confidently, drawing on his hard-earned knowledge and experiences. But as the conversation progressed, he couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Palmer was scrutinizing him a bit too closely. There was an unspoken tension in the room, one Jamal recognized all too well. "Tell me, Mr. Edwards," Mr. Palmer said, leaning back in his chair, "what makes you believe you're the right fit for this role? We're looking for someone who can excel in a fast-pacing, high-pressure environment." Jamal took a deep breath. He knew this was the moment to prove himself. "I've faced challenges my whole life," he began. "Growing up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce taught me resilience. I worked my way through community college while holding down multiple jobs, and I've learned how to adapt quickly and stay focused under pressure. But beyond that," he continued, "I bring a perspective shaped by real-world experience. I understand the value of hard work, and I'm committed to not just meeting expectations, but exceeding them. This isn't just a job for me. It's an opportunity to make a difference, both for myself and for my family." Mr. Palmer studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Impressive," he said finally. "We'll be in touch." Jamal left the office feeling a mix of relief and uncertainty. The interview had gone well, or at least as well as he could have hoped, but he couldn't shake the doubt that lingered in his mind. As he stepped outside, the city seemed even louder than before. He paused on the sidewalk, the weight of the morning settling over him. Then, almost as if on cue, his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket and saw an unfamiliar number. Hesitating for a moment, he answered. "Hello." "Mr. Edwards," said a familiar voice. "This is Eleanor Whitmore." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. "Mrs. Whitmore, it's great to hear from you." "I just wanted to follow up," she said. "I spoke to someone at my late husband's firm. They're expecting your application. Please don't hesitate to use my name." Jamal was stunned. "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't know how to thank you." "You already did," she said warmly. "Now go make the most of it, and don't let anyone tell you you're not good enough." Her words stayed with him as he made his way home. That evening, he sat down at his kitchen table and carefully prepared his application for Whitmore and Brooks Financial Group. He poured everything he had into it, determined to seize this opportunity. A week later, Jamal received a call inviting him for an interview at Whitmore and Brooks. This time, he felt a quiet confidence as he stepped into the firm's offices. The interviewers were welcoming but professional, and Jamal found himself speaking with ease about his goals and aspirations. 2 days later, the phone call came. He had been offered the position. When he shared the news with his mother, Angela's eyes filled with tears of pride. "I always knew you'd make it, baby," she said, pulling him into a tight hug. As Jamal settled into his new role at Whitmore and Brooks, he often thought of the journey that had brought him there. He thought of his mother's sacrifices, Mr. Johnson's wisdom, and the unexpected kindness of Mrs. Whitmore. One afternoon, a few weeks into his new job, he received a handwritten note in the mail. "Dear Jamal, I couldn't be prouder of the path you've taken. Remember, success isn't just about what you achieve. It's about how you lift others along the way. Keep being the extraordinary young man you are. Warm regards, Eleanor Whitmore." Jamal smiled as he read the note, his heart full. He tucked it into his desk drawer, a reminder of the power of kindness and the unexpected connections that could change a life. And so, as the city continued its endless rhythm, Jamal found his place within it. Not just as a young man chasing success, but as someone determined to give back, just as others had given to him. That's a wrap. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories.